Now the next book, it's called The Jews of Spain and Portugal and the Inquisition by Frederic David Mocatta, published in 1877. Let's see what this guy says about the Jews who were banished. We're on page 57. We're going to start right here. Unfortunately, at the time of the expulsion, the plague was raging in Castile, and the fugitives brought with them the disease, propagating it wherever they went, and not unnaturally causing their advent to be viewed with loathing and horror. This circumstance induced King John to hasten their departure from Portugal, for which purpose ships were duly provided according to the agreement, but such was the temper of the captains and sailors that they subjugated the Jews to the hardest possible conditions. They plundered them of their goods and valuables, even to their very clothes, and landed them naked and bare of everything on barren points of the African coast, leaving them to die of starvation or to be sold into slavery to the Moors. We can stop right there because that's what we want to get at. So it's saying that the Jews on the African coast, they either died of starvation or they were sold into slavery to the Moors. Now, when it says Moors here, I'm not entirely sure that it's talking about the same Moors that we were talking about in part 2. I'm more leaning toward the fact that these were the Arabic Moors. Because as we go on in part 3, as we continue to go on, we're going to read sources that say the Moors were sold into slavery as well. And we all know how, people like to say that the Moors were Arabic or Berber type of thing now in modern times. That's what they try to say. So this is more likely talking about those type of Moors, not the Moors that were in Spain, not the black Moors. And we're going to continue reading, and we'll see later on that the Moors were sold into slavery too. So that also makes it seem like it's not talking about the same type of Moors that we were discussing earlier. But regardless, Caucasian Sephardic Jewish people were never sold into slavery in Africa. That's a fact. And there's so much evidence of black people being slaves in Africa, I don't even need to pull any of that up. We know that black people were slaves in Africa, just like we know the sun rises and sets every day, and just like we know that grass is green. And the next book is called Fulfilled Prophecy and Proof of the Truth of Scripture by Bourchier, Wrey, Savile, published in 1882. We're on page 46. I'm going to zoom in. We're going to start right here. Their banishment from Spain is recorded by a Jewish author in these words. So we know it's talking about Jews who were banished. A decree was made and proclaimed publicly that all Jews should change their religion in 3 months' time. A Barbanel who had then a place at court petitioned the king to revoke the edict and be content with those estates which they offered him. But all in vain, for 300,000 old and young men and women, and he among the rest, went away upon foot one day not knowing whither to go. Some went to Portugal. When you get into the history, the Spanish and Portuguese Jews were the same people. The Jews from Spain, they just went into Portugal, and the same thing ended up happening. They just ended up getting banished from Portugal. Some went to Portugal, others into Navarre, where they conflicted with many calamities. For some became a prey to wild beasts or perished by famine and pestilence. Others committed themselves to the sea, hoping to find rest in some other countries. But on the sea they met with new disasters. For many were sold as slaves when they came on any coast, many were drowned, many burnt in the ships which were set on fire. In short, all suffered the just punishment of God the Avenger. So what we wanted from here, this is another source saying that Jews, when they came on any coast after they were banished, many were sold as slaves. There is no documented history anywhere of Caucasian Sephardic Jewish people being slaves anywhere at all. So we know that these last 2 documents talking about Jews being banished and then ending up as slaves in other countries, it's not talking about these people at all. This next book is called America, being the latest and most accurate description of the New World. It's a long title. It was originally by John Ogilby, I believe, but right here it says Montanus Arnoldus. Oh yeah, John Ogilby right here. It is published by 1671. I guess it has more than one author. We're going to be on page 574. Right here at the top. and we need some context. It says St. Thomas right here, so it's talking about St. Thomas on this page. And we can go down a little bit. You see right here on the side, it says the first colony sent thither by John III, King of Portugal. So this is talking about a place where Jews were banished to. It's talking about, St. Thomas. It says the Portuguese that dwelt on this island, the island of St. Thomas, informed the Netherlanders that few lived above 50 years there, yet notwithstanding the great gain tempted them to tarry. Several of them having 200 or 300 Negroes that worked in the sugar mills, that John III, King of Portugal, sent a colony thither above 200 years before, whom though the unwholesome air destroyed, yet the place was not left desolate. For he sent new inhabitants, who first settled in Guinea, next in Angola, and lastly on the island of St. Thomas, that so they might be better used to the air. That the said king sold all those Jews for slaves that refused to embrace the Roman religion and caused their children to be baptized, from whom, coming thither in great numbers, most of the present inhabitants were descended. So we can see it starts off talking about Negroes working in sugar mills. The Portuguese had Negroes on this island working in sugar mills. And then it says King John sent new inhabitants, and it says he sold all those Jews for slaves that refused to embrace the Roman religion. Now keep in mind right here how it says Negroes were working in the sugar mills on St. Thomas. And then it goes on to talk about how the king sold all those Jews for slaves to St. Thomas. This next book is called Portuguese Exploration to the West and the Formation of Brazil, 1450 to 1800. It's from Brown University. You can see right here. We're going to be on page 17. And I shall zoom in. Let's read. Keep in mind, the last source said that the Portuguese had Negroes working in the sugar mills, and then it started talking about how King John sold all those Jews for slaves to St. Thomas, who didn't embrace the Roman religion. By the year 1470, the Portuguese had found the equatorial island of Sao Tome, which is St. Thomas, in the Guinean Gulf off the African coast. The climate proved to be extremely unwholesome for Europeans, and settlement was slow. The official chronicler of King João, which is King John II, Garcia de Resende, reports on one of the methods to populate this island that also throws some light on a tragic form of Jewish participation in the Portuguese Atlantic Empire. The king had allowed Jewish refugees from Spain, from where they had been expelled in 1492, to remain in Portugal only in return for payment of an enormous ransom. In 1493, those who could not pay had their children taken away from them, baptized by force, and deported to Sao Tome, which is St. Thomas, in order to be raised as Christians and to help populate the island that the king had just leased to Álvaro de Camina at an annual rent of 100,000 reais. Nothing is known of their further fate, talking about the Jews who were banished, although later chroniclers attribute the thriving sugar production on the island to the talents of these deported children and their offspring. So when we go back to this previous source, it says the Portuguese that dwelt on this island informed the Netherlanders that few lived above 50 years there, yet notwithstanding the great gain tempted them to tarry, several of them having 200 or 300 Negroes that worked in the sugar mills. Negroes working in the sugar mills. And then it says, later chroniclers attribute the thriving sugar production on the island of Sao Tome, St. Thomas. They attributed the thriving sugar production on that island to the talents of these deported children and their offspring, pretty much saying that the Jews who were banished were responsible for the thriving sugar production on the island of St. Thomas. In the previous book, said that there were Negroes working in the sugar mills. That previous source is just pretty much talking about how Jews kept being banished to that island to work as slaves. And we read in the sources before that the Jews were sold as slaves whenever they got to any coast, and that they were sold as slaves when they reached Africa. They were being called Negroes at that point because they were because they were slaves. And like I said, there's no documented history anywhere of Caucasian Jewish people being slaves in Africa.